There is an island off the coast of Africa where the majority of the population carries Filipino DNA. Not a trace of it, not an echo. The majority. This island is closer to Mozambique than it is to Manila. It is surrounded by African nations, shaped by African geography, and yet encoded in the bodies of its people is a genetic signature that points directly back to the Philippine archipelago. That is not a theory. That is what the DNA says. Mitochondrial haplogroup analysis, peer-reviewed linguistic studies, and population genetics research published in journals including PLOS Genetics and the Proceedings of the Royal Society, B, all point to the same conclusion. Filipino ancestors didn't just sail, they colonized an island 5,000 miles away, and the proof has been sitting in the genome of millions of people this entire time. Most people think of Filipino history as something that begins with colonization, as if the story of this archipelago only matters once someone else arrived to name it. Before China's trade routes, before any outside power drew a line around these islands, Filipino sailors had already crossed the Indian Ocean and built a civilization on the other side of the world. We are going to cover the founding population, the exact ocean route they used, the words that survived the crossing unchanged, the genetic evidence that confirmed everything, the geographic paradox that still confuses scientists, and the timeline debate that keeps rewriting itself. That island is Madagascar. When we think of a civilization, we imagine thousands of people, armies, fleets, generations of settlers building something from nothing. The assumption is that spreading culture across an ocean requires massive numbers. History books are full of conquests, migrations, and colonizations that moved entire peoples. But the genetic record doesn't show a nation. It shows something almost impossible, a number so small it should have doomed everything that came after it. The entire Filipino-descended population of this African island traces back to fewer than 30 individuals, and genetic science can name the exact founding moment. Population geneticists analyzing maternal lineages found that the Austronesian origin population of Madagascar descends from an estimated 30 women. Not 300, not 3,000. 30. Studies published in PLOS Genetics trace this through mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child across more than 50 generations. Picture it this way. Every Malagasy person who carries Filipino ancestry, and that's the majority of the island's population today, is descended from a group small enough to fit inside a single large outrigger vessel. The founding population wasn't a fleet. It may have been one boat. And yet those 30 individuals didn't just survive. They built a civilization. And what those 30 people built didn't disappear. The Malagasy language spoken by millions today. A rice cultivation system that still feeds the island. An outrigger canoe culture, a musical tradition, a cosmological framework, all of it traceable, through an unbroken line, back to the Philippine archipelago. Geneticists describe it as one of the most dramatic founder effects ever documented in human population history. This matters for the larger story because it reframes everything that follows. We are not talking about a broad, diffuse migration of Southeast Asian peoples slowly drifting westward over millennia. We are talking about a specific event, a single crossing, a single group, a single moment when Filipino ancestors stepped onto African soil and changed the genetic map of the world. That explains how few they were, but it doesn't explain how they got there. And the route they took is where the story gets stranger. Every map you've ever seen places the Philippines in one corner of the world and Madagascar in the opposite. The distance between them is so extreme that even modern cargo ships take weeks to cross it. For centuries, historians assumed that ancient peoples simply stayed close to shore, that open ocean crossings of that scale were beyond them. But the wind patterns, the currents, and the stars tell a completely different story, and someone, thousands of years ago, already knew how to read all three. Your ancestors didn't drift accidentally. They sailed a deliberate 5,000-mile open ocean route that Western historians insisted was impossible until the DNA said otherwise. The proposed route runs from the Philippine or Indonesian archipelago westward across the Indian Ocean, likely following seasonal monsoon winds. Researchers studying Austronesian migration patterns have identified a corridor that ancient mariners could have used with precision. It is sometimes called the cinnamon route, named for the spice trade that would later follow the same winds, and it runs westward across the Indian Ocean, timed to the southwest monsoon, which blows reliably toward the East African coast between June and September. These weren't random crossings, they were scheduled ones. The archaeological and linguistic record supports this. Ancient Malagasy canoes, the Lakana, are structurally identical to Philippine and Indonesian outrigger vessels, not to anything built on the African continent. Studies in maritime anthropology show that Austronesian peoples had mastered deep ocean navigation centuries before European explorers would even attempt it. They used star paths, swell patterns, and bird behavior as instruments. The ocean wasn't a barrier to them, it was a road. What makes this extraordinary for Filipinos specifically is that the navigational technology required, the double outrigger, the crab claw sail, the star compass, originated in the archipelago that would become the Philippines. The people who crossed that ocean weren't borrowing someone else's knowledge, they were using their own. This reframes the Filipino ancestors not as island people who stayed put, but as the greatest open ocean navigators in the ancient world, a people who crossed the Indian Ocean with fewer instruments than you carry in your pocket and arrived exactly where they intended. That explains how they moved. But knowing the route makes the next part even harder to believe, because what they carried with them wasn't just DNA, it was language. And some of it never changed. Languages die. They mix, they evolve, they get swallowed by dominant cultures, especially after centuries of isolation and colonial pressure. The conventional wisdom is that after 1,000 years and 5,000 miles of separation, any linguistic connection between two peoples would be too eroded to detect. And then linguists started comparing the words, and they couldn't explain what they were finding. Words your Lola used every day still exist, unchanged in the African island, preserved in isolation for over 1,000 years. Malagasy is classified by linguists as a Malayo-Polynesian language, the same family as Filipino, Tagalog, Cebuano, and Ilocano. But the connection goes deeper than family. Researchers comparing basic vocabulary lists found direct cognates, words with the same root, the same sound, and the same meaning, between Malagasy and the languages of the Philippine archipelago and the Burrito region of Borneo. The word for eye, the word for water, the word for hand, numbers, body parts, agricultural terms. Here is one concrete example the record shows. The Malagasy word for rice, veri, shares a direct root with the Proto-Austronesian term for cooked rice. Not in Tagalog specifically, but in the Proto-Austronesian root system that Filipino languages share, a root that survives across the family today. Rice wasn't just food they brought. It was a word they kept, across an ocean, for 1,000 years. Linguists estimate that Malagasy preserves approximately 90% of its Austronesian core vocabulary, an unusually high retention rate for a language that has been geographically isolated and surrounded by Bantu-speaking African neighbors for over 10 centuries. The linguistic isolation of Madagascar actually worked as a preservation chamber, keeping ancient Filipino-linked vocabulary intact long after it evolved or disappeared in the original source regions. This is significant for the larger story because it means the connection isn't just genetic, it's cultural and cognitive. The people of Madagascar didn't just share blood with Filipino ancestors. They shared the architecture of thought, the same words for the things that matter most: family, food, the body, the earth. If that already changes how you see this, wait until you hear the genetic evidence, because what the linguists suspected, the scientists confirmed with a precision no one was prepared for. For decades, the Filipino-Malagasy connection was treated as a compelling theory. Interesting, plausible, but ultimately unproven. Historians pointed to similarities in culture and language, but without hard biological evidence, the skeptics always had room to doubt. A theory is not a fact. And then the DNA arrived. A 2012 study found that this island's population carries a specific genetic marker shared almost exclusively with the Philippines, a marker that has no business being anywhere near Africa. Finding the same haplogroup in Madagascar and the Philippines is not like finding a family resemblance. It is like finding the same fingerprint. The researchers estimated that roughly half of Madagascar's maternal lineages trace directly to Southeast Asian origin, with the Philippines identified as one of the most statistically significant source populations. The implication is staggering. In a country located off the coast of Africa, surrounded by African nations, with centuries of African migration and intermarriage layered into its history, the genetic signature of the Philippines survived. It did not dilute to invisibility. It stayed. This is the moment in the story where the theory becomes proof. Not a cultural echo, not a linguistic hint, a biological fact written in the DNA of millions of people living on an island 5,000 miles from Manila. Filipino ancestry did not visit Madagascar. It built it. If you have never heard this in a history class, that is not an accident, and it is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. That explains the what. But it doesn't explain the where, and the geography of this connection is where the story gets genuinely strange. Geography is supposed to determine ancestry. The closer a population lives to another group, the more they intermingle, intermarry, and share DNA. It's the basic logic behind every migration map ever drawn: proximity equals connection. But one island broke that rule so completely that it forced scientists to rewrite the model entirely. The island sits closer to the African coast than to any point in Asia, yet its people are genetically more Filipino than many modern Filipinos. Madagascar is separated from the African continent by the Mozambique Channel, roughly 400 kilometers at its narrowest point. That's a short crossing. African peoples have lived across that channel for millennia. Bantu-speaking populations arrived in Madagascar and contributed significantly to its genetic makeup. And yet, when researchers mapped the dominant ancestry of the Merina, Madagascar's largest ethnic group, concentrated in the Central Highlands, the Southeast Asian component doesn't just compete with African ancestry. In some lineages, it dominates it. Studies suggest that in the Central Highland populations, Austronesian ancestry can account for up to 50% or more of the total genetic profile. Centuries of intermarriage with neighboring populations left their mark, and the Filipino genetic signal is still standing. The geographic paradox runs even deeper. The Philippines is not the closest Austronesian nation to Madagascar. Indonesia is closer. And yet Philippine-linked haplogroups appear with distinctive frequency in the Malagasy genetic record, suggesting that the founding group didn't simply come from the nearest available Southeast Asian coastline. They came from a specific place, with a specific genetic profile, and sailed past closer options to reach an island off Africa. This matters because it dismantles the lazy explanation that Madagascar was simply close enough to Southeast Asia for accidental contact. It wasn't. Someone chose this island. Someone knew it was there. And the question of when they made that choice is where the final piece falls into place. The official historical record gives us a date, a timeline, a neat explanation for how Filipinos ended up in Madagascar. Scholars have debated the details for generations, but the rough consensus has always centered on the early medieval period, a time when most of the ancient world's great migrations were already well documented. And then one genetic marker came back with a date that no historian had predicted, and it didn't fit the timeline at all. The official date puts the migration at 650 AD. But one genetic marker pushes that back to at least 350 AD, meaning Filipino sailors reached Africa before the Viking Age even began. The 650 AD date comes from linguistic drift models and early archaeological evidence from coastal Madagascar, the oldest physical traces of Austronesian-style settlements that researchers have been able to date with confidence. For decades, this was the anchor. Everything else was organized around it. But mitochondrial DNA doesn't follow historical consensus. When researchers dated the Malagasy Austronesian haplogroups directly, the results pointed earlier. Studies suggest the founding genetic event falls somewhere between 300 AD and 500 AD, with 350 AD as the most likely midpoint. To understand what that means, 350 AD is nearly 3 centuries before the Viking Age began. It is the era of the late Roman Empire. It is before Islam existed. It is before most of the civilizations we associate with ancient history had even reached their peak. And at that moment, according to the genetics, Filipino ancestral peoples were already living on an island off the coast of Africa. The debate is not fully settled. Some researchers maintain the 650 AD date is defensible when linguistic and archaeological evidence is weighted alongside genetics. Others argue the molecular clock points firmly to an earlier founding. But the significance of the disagreement itself is the point, because even the conservative end of the genetic range rewrites the story. This is not a footnote in maritime history. This is the lead. Filipino ancestors didn't follow the ancient world's great explorers. In the Indian Ocean, they were the great explorers. They were first. That island off the coast of Africa, the one that had no business carrying Filipino DNA, carries it anyway. The distance didn't stop it. The centuries didn't erase it. The science confirmed what the ocean already knew. This isn't just a story about Madagascar. It's proof that Filipino identity was never contained by geography. That before anyone drew borders around these islands, your ancestors were already redefining what the edges of the world meant. The narrative that Filipinos are a people things happen to is the narrative that needs to end. What the DNA shows is a people who happened to the world, who crossed 5,000 miles of open ocean and left a mark so deep it still shows up in a lab test 1,000 years later. While Rome was falling, your ancestors were building. Somewhere on an island closer to Africa than to Asia, a child was born today carrying a genetic signature that traces back to the Philippine archipelago. They don't know your name, they don't speak your language. But somewhere in their biology, written in a code that outlasted every empire that tried to define this region, is the proof that your ancestors were there first. If this changed how you see Filipino history, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because this is only the beginning.